This bone was no bigger than a matchbox, but it rewrote human history. It belonged to an adult woman, yet it was so tiny, so alien, that scientists questioned if it was even human. And what they discovered, buried 6 meters below the jungle floor of a remote Indonesian island, would leave the scientific community in complete chaos. Now, before we expose the freakish truth hiding in that cave, let's rewind to the moment that sparked it all. The 6th of September, 2003. A sweaty afternoon on the island of Flores. Rafiq Harsono, an Indonesian archaeologist who had spent weeks digging into the ancient cave known as Liang Tabira, was ready to call it quits. His team was tired, covered in dust, and the dig site looked like it had already given up all its secrets. But then, clink. Rafiq's trowel struck something that didn't belong. He brushed away the dirt, revealing what looked like part of a human skull. It was so small, the immediate thought was obvious. This had to be a child. But something wasn't right. Over the next few days, as they slowly unearthed more of the skeleton, the unsettling truth began to take shape. The teeth. They were adult, teeth fully developed, permanent, and unmistakable. This wasn't a child at all. This was a grown woman, and she was smaller than most toddlers. When the skeleton was finally uncovered, it revealed a species that defied everything science thought it knew about the human lineage. She stood barely 3 feet tall, her brain roughly the size of a grapefruit smaller than a chimpanzee's. And yet, scattered around her were advanced stone tools and butchered bones from dwarf elephants she'd apparently helped hunt. The discovery was so outrageous that half the scientific community simply refused to accept it. They thought it had to be a hoax, or a modern human with a rare condition. But this was no hoax. The remains, now dubbed KT-1, short for Kaisel Tankas or Tiny Agile, ignited a scientific firestorm. And here's where things get even stranger. Because no one ever talks about the nightmare world this tiny woman lived in. Picture this. Waking up every morning knowing your backyard might contain something big enough to eat you in 2 bites. Forget tropical paradise, this island was evolution's version of a haunted house. Imagine rats the size of Jack Russell Terriers scuttling past your feet. Now throw in lizards longer than a minivan, armed with venomous saliva and a bad attitude. Yes, we're talking Komodo dragons, but back then, they weren't the docile zoo creatures we see behind glass. These were bloodthirsty predators that could take down a water buffalo and still have room for dessert. And smack in the middle of this deadly ecosystem were the tiniest humans ever discovered. KT-1 and her people somehow survived on an island crawling with monsters. And not just survived, they thrived. They crafted sharp, clean stone tools. They hunted in teams. They brought down animals 10 times their size like stegodons, dwarf relatives of elephants that were still twice the height of these humans. And they did it all with brains that modern scientists would have laughed at until they realized these so-called hobbits might be smarter than we thought. Scientists called them Flores minimus, but among researchers, they were jokingly nicknamed the Sprites, after their bizarre resemblance to Tolkien's fantasy characters. Except this wasn't fiction. These miniature humans were real, and they threw a wrench into everything we thought we understood about evolution. Never before had we found people this small who could do so much. The biggest mystery, though, wasn't how smart they were, it was how they got that way. Where did they come from? Were they always this tiny? And what on earth could have triggered such a bizarre transformation? The explanation that scientists pieced together sounds like a Hollywood sci-fi plot, but it's backed by cold, hard fossil evidence. Roughly 1 million years ago, a group of Homo erectus, tall, upright, tool-wielding ancestors, somehow managed to cross the dangerous, shark-infested waters that separate Indonesia's islands from the mainland. And no, they didn't have boats. The most likely theory? They floated by accident, swept away during storms on giant clumps of tangled trees and plant debris. Imagine being the poor guy clinging to a log, wondering why his vacation took such a weird turn. The few survivors who landed on the island of Flores found themselves marooned in a place that felt like a glitch in nature's design. No big predators, little food, and nowhere to run. And in conditions like these, evolution stops playing fair. Bigger isn't better anymore. Being small suddenly means survival. Smaller bodies need less food, they can reproduce faster, and they don't waste energy lugging around unnecessary bulk. But here's where the science broke people's brains. Normally, this kind of size reduction takes hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years. It's evolution's slowest diet plan. But these early humans? They didn't just slim down, they collapsed. From basketball player height to under 3-foot size in what might be the evolutionary equivalent of a blink. We're talking about an extreme, turbocharged transformation. These early island settlers likely started out standing around 5.5 feet tall. But within a shockingly short span, maybe 300,000 years, they had shrunk down to about 3 feet. And they stayed that way for over 500,000 years. No further change, no growth spurts, just tiny, perfectly adapted survival machines. But why such drastic shrinkage? The answer lies in the island itself. Because Flores wasn't some chilled-out vacation hotspot. It was an active volcanic island with patchy freshwater, brutal dry seasons, and a grocery store that closed for good about 800,000 years ago. Survival meant adaptation or extinction. And for the Sprites, being fun-sized wasn't just helpful. It was the difference between life and death. Think about this. Our early ancestors needed massive territories and huge calorie intakes just to stay alive. But these little humans had cracked the cheat code. They could slide through thick underbrush like ghosts. Food shortages that would have wiped out a regular tribe, the Sprites needed only a fraction to keep going. Because they were so small, their communities could thrive in places that would have starved bigger humans. Every inch of their biology had been fine-tuned by evolution to meet the brutal demands of island life. And here's the kicker. Despite their brain size being closer to a fruit than a football, these people were anything but primitive. At excavation sites like Mata Mere and Liang Tabira, archaeologists found a whole toolkit of specialized stone implements, not just random rocks, but purpose-built tools for cutting, scraping, carving, and butchering. They weren't stumbling through life. They were thinking, planning, and crafting. And they weren't lone hunters either. Evidence suggests these tiny people worked in teams to bring down massive prey, like Stegodon's mini elephants that still towered over them like woolly skyscrapers. How did they coordinate? How did they communicate? And most hauntingly, what happened to them? Some researchers argue they may have even mastered fire, though the evidence is still hotly contested. What's certain is this: they were expert butchers. Their kills were processed with surgical precision, the leftover bones cleanly sliced, as if done by tiny, prehistoric surgeons who knew exactly where to cut. And they achieved all this with brains 1/3 the size of ours, roughly the cranial real estate of a coconut. For nearly 1,000,000 years, these pint-sized humans ruled their island kingdom. Generation after generation, they evolved to meet the harsh demands of Flores. They stayed small, stayed smart, and adapted in ways that would make modern survivalists look like amateur campers. They were proof that you didn't need a towering frame or a swollen brain to thrive in the wild. But then, something changed, and what happened next flips the entire story into something darker. After surviving for close to 1,000,000 years, these little giants vanished fast. Not over millennia, but within just a few thousand years, gone. Erased. And when scientists looked at the timeline, a chilling pattern emerged. Their disappearance lines up almost perfectly with the arrival of someone else, us. That's right, modern humans. Our ancestors had just figured out how to build real boats, navigate across dangerous waters, and reach places previously untouched. Once humans made it to Southeast Asia, the countdown began. And not long after we showed up, the Sprites were no more. Did we wipe them out? There's no evidence of battles or bloodshed, no spears through skeletons. But extinction doesn't always need violence. Maybe we brought diseases they couldn't resist. Maybe we beat them in the race for food. Or maybe we just rolled in like party crashers and outcompeted them into oblivion. Some even speculate there was interbreeding, that they were absorbed into the human gene pool. But so far, no DNA has been recovered from their bones. Flores' hot, humid climate has erased every genetic clue. All we have left is archaeology, and those last layers of Liang Tabira cave tell a silent story. First come the bones and tools of the Sprites, then thick ash from a volcanic eruption, a natural disaster that might have done more damage than any war. And above that, the unmistakable artifacts of modern humans. The smallest humans in history were suddenly replaced by the most dominant. But the story didn't end there. In fact, what came next shattered even more assumptions. The discovery of Flores minimus didn't just add a new species to the book set, forced scientists to rethink the entire human origin story. For years, we believed that bigger brains meant smarter people, that larger bodies meant evolutionary winners, that our path from tree-swinging primates to smartphone-checking sapiens was the only way forward. Turns out, none of that was true. These tiny island dwellers proved that intelligence could evolve in ways we never expected, that survival could come in small packages, that being human wasn't about hitting some checklist of traits, it was about adapting, enduring, outsmarting nature in ways that didn't require muscle or mass. And then came 2019. Scientists made another startling find, this time in the Philippines. Another species of small-bodied humans named Homo luzonensis. They were even tinier than the Sprites, hinting that island dwarfism might have been a go-to move for early humans trying to survive in Southeast Asia's scattered island chains. We still don't know how the Sprites relate to other humans. The DNA we'd need to untangle their family tree has long since disintegrated. All that's left is what they made, and what they left behind. Sharp stones, shattered bones, and a mystery that's only grown deeper. Today, you can walk straight into the shadows of Liang Tabira cave, stare into the very trenches where the Sprites once walked, and wonder how such small people left such a big mystery. Local folklore still whispers about the Lilipu, tiny forest dwellers who, according to the islanders, lived nearby until just a few generations ago. Were these stories faded memories of the last surviving Sprites? Or just myths that sprang up from imagination? Nobody knows for sure, but the cave itself still speaks. Every dig season brings new surprises, more bone fragments, sharper tools, clearer evidence that these tiny humans weren't some evolutionary hiccup. They were something far more complex. What's even more curious, the current inhabitants of Flores, like the Rampasa people, are also notably short. But genetics tells us they aren't direct descendants of the Sprites. Their size is just another example of nature's repeating patterns. When the conditions are right, small is smart. Meanwhile, researchers are still combing through the endless maze of islands across Southeast Asia. Each remote patch of land could hold the next chapter in this bizarre and fascinating saga. Because once you've found one forgotten species of human, why not more? What if every isolated island has its own version of humanity's remix? The tale of the Sprites flips the whole idea of human progress on its head. Evolution wasn't a neat staircase from ape to genius. It was chaos. It was creativity. It was populations solving the problem of survival in completely different ways. While we were growing tall and spreading wide, these little giants were quietly perfecting a different kind of success. Today, we live in a world obsessed with more taller, stronger, faster, smarter. But the tiniest humans who ever lived survived for nearly 1 million years on one of the most dangerous islands on the planet. They had simple tools, tiny brains, and bodies smaller than most 10-year-olds. And yet, they won. They carved out homes, organized hunts, raised families, left behind a legacy that still has modern scientists scratching their heads. All without skyscrapers, smartphones, or even pants. So here's the part that really messes with your head. If they could survive hell on Earth with a brain the size of an orange, what's our excuse? What would we become if we were stripped of comfort, tossed into the wild, and forced to adapt again? Could we even survive? These little humans weren't just survivors, they were specialists, evolution's smallest champions, and their legacy isn't just fossils and tool sets, a reminder that the human story is still being written, that evolution hasn't stopped, and that our assumptions about what makes us human might be a lot more fragile than we think. The tools they once held are now buried in silence, but the questions they left behind, those are louder than ever. Because the truth is, sometimes the biggest questions in science don't come from the biggest bones. They come from the smallest people.